For 3 years, I was married to Pei Yu, while he redeemed a courtesan to be his mistress. In response, I kept 38 lovers of my own. We maintained this unspoken agreement, each living in our separate worlds. Until I took in a new lover, he not only dismissed all 38 of my previous lovers, but also pressured me to divorce Pei Yu. Reluctantly, I placed the divorce papers before Pei Yu, fully expecting him to agree without hesitation. To my surprise, he tore the papers apart, pinned me against the wall, his eyes blazing with fury. Dream on. I hadn't expected Pei Yu's mistress to come to see me standing outside the vermilion gates of my palace, dressed in a simple yet elegant smoky gauze gown. Liu Pian-yu looked as delicate as a willow swaying in the breeze, her waist so slender it seemed it could be snapped in a mere gesture. Her pale face flickered with a trace of fear, yet she forced herself to curtsy, her voice soft and hesitant. "Your Highness, Pei Lang is quite drunk tonight. He won't be able to return to the palace. I was afraid Your Highness might worry, so I came to inform you. It's no wonder Pei Yu adored her." Her voice alone was like the most intoxicating wind of Jiangnan. He didn't even care about his reputation when he bought her freedom before I could respond. "Bai Dao, my maid," snapped. "His Grace's affairs are none of your business. You're not worthy of standing here, let alone speaking to Her Highness." Liu Pian-yu trembled, biting down hard on her lower lip before daring to raise her head. "I apologize for my rudeness, but Pei Lang, Pei Yu's drunkenness would have been reported by his servants. For Liu Pian-yu, his mistress, to step into my palace and inform me that Pei Yu would not return tonight was nothing short of a public slap to my face." I smirked and looked her over with cold amusement. "If I were to have you beaten to death right here, right now, do you think Pei Lang would arrive in time to save you?" Her face went ghostly pale, her teeth sinking into her lip as she stood, silent and trembling. I gazed at her quietly. She was Pei Yu's beloved, the woman I had once despised above all else. I had hated her for the simple fact that, in Pei Yu's heart, I, a princess, was worth less than a courtesan because of her. Pei Yu and I had fought bitterly, turning from husband and wife to enemies, but now, I found it laughable how ridiculous that I had let myself lose all dignity for a woman so utterly foolish. Just as I was about to speak, Liu Pian-yu suddenly began to kowtow violently, her forehead soon bleeding. In a trembling voice, she wept. "It was I who angered Your Highness. I deserve 1,000 deaths. How foolish I had been to lose all my dignity over such an insignificant woman." Just as I was about to speak, Liu Pian-yu suddenly began to kowtow fiercely, her forehead quickly smeared with blood, and with a sob in her voice, she cried out, "It was I who angered Your Highness. I deserve 1,000 deaths." I froze, and at that moment, Pei Yu's voice, heavy with anger, echoed through the air. "Chen Zhao, what are you doing?" Pei Yu strode in, the scent of alcohol still clinging to him. He was dressed in a long robe of pale moonlight, intricately embroidered with clouds, his dark hair held up by a jade pin, his features as striking as ever, but his eyes were filled with cold disdain and distance. He lifted Liu Pian-yu to her feet, the loathing and fury barely concealed in his gaze. "Pian-yu is nothing more than a fragile woman. If you wanted me back, you could have just asked. Why torment her?" Pei Yu was always composed, never one to act rashly. He wasn't a fool, he knew exactly what was going on. But the moment he saw Liu Pian-yu in tears, he lost all sense of reason. Convinced I was the one who had wronged her a year ago, I would have erupted in fury, shouting at him until we both were spent. But now, I merely replied in a calm tone. With so many witnesses here, everyone saw it was she who suddenly began to kneel and bang her head on the floor. "Pei Yu, if you're unwell, seek treatment. Don't come here to act insane in front of me." Pei Yu's movement faltered. Immediately, Liu Pian-yu clutched his sleeve, her tears falling like pearls onto the ground as she choked out, "Pei Lang, I forgot my place and offended Her Highness. It's only right that she is displeased. Please don't defy her on my behalf." I was thoroughly sick of Liu Pian-yu's theatrics. It had been the same ever since we got married in the first year of our marriage. Pei Yu and I gradually grew to understand each other. There were moments of peace between us. Though he often mocked me for my lack of interest in books, he would still patiently explain historical anecdotes whenever I asked. Occasionally, he would even guide my hand as I practiced my calligraphy. Back then, I thought Pei Yu and I might one day become a loving couple like any other, but then, Liu Pianyu appeared, crying to Pei Yu, begging him to buy her freedom. Every time Pei Yu spent time with me at the palace, she would send word that she was feeling unwell, demanding his attention when I could bear it no longer and confronted her. She would weep pitifully in front of Pei Yu, making me seem unreasonable and domineering. Over time, Pei Yu grew distant. He no longer looked at me, and eventually, he refused to even glance my way. Whatever you have to say it inside. Stop making a scene here. I turned and entered the house. As Pei Yu helped Liu Pianyu in after me, I took a folded divorce letter from my sleeve and placed it before him. Let's divorce. Pei Yu was silent for a moment, a familiar look of impatience flashing across his face. Lin Zhao, what are you trying to pull now? I paused for a moment, then answered truthfully, I have someone else in my heart. He wants me to divorce you and marry him. For a brief moment, Pei Yu's face went blank, but then it quickly morphed into disdain. I paused for a moment before speaking the truth. I've fallen for someone else. He wants me to divorce you and marry him. For a brief instant, Pei Yu's face went blank, but it was quickly replaced by disdain. Lin Zhao, I'm not leaving Pianyu. There's no need for you to keep testing me with these flimsy excuses. Didn't we already agree? You stay out of my affairs with Pianyu, and I'll stay out of yours with your lovers. Are you going back on that now as expected? Pei Yu still believed I was clinging to him, throwing tantrums with a patience I barely felt. I replied, this time, it's different. I swear if we divorce, Liu Pian, you won't have to endure being your mistress anymore. You can marry her as your official wife. Isn't that what you want? A flicker of joy crossed Liu Pianyu's face as she tugged at Pei Yu's sleeve, but Pei Yu didn't seem to notice. His expression darkened. Stop playing games. You'll divorce me now, and then later you'll be on your knees begging me not to. Chen Zhao, how many times must you pull this stunt? It was true. I had threatened divorce more times than I could count, each time after a heated argument. Then, once he agreed, I would beg him not to leave. There was even a time when I knelt before him, pleading for him to stay. I was the beloved Princess Zhao Yang, cherished by the Emperor and Empress, and I had never knelt before anyone in my life yet. I knelt for him, but even then, Pei Yu heartlessly shrugged me off and walked away. Looking back now, I realize how foolish I was. All the absurd things I did for Pei Yu. For Liu Pianyu, I cried, screamed, and threatened to take my own life, losing every shred of dignity a princess should have, all for the hope that Pei Yu might return to me night after night. I sat alone, staring at the bed curtains, wondering what Pei Yu and Liu Pianyu were doing together. At that very moment it tore me apart. Finally, I understood. Pei Yu would never love me. That's when I started seeking revenge. I refused to grant him a divorce, keeping him from openly marrying Liu Pianyu. I made sure the woman he loved would remain a nameless mistress forever. I took lover after lover, placing one shameful crown of infidelity after another upon Pei Yu's head, becoming the most scandalous princess in the entire kingdom of Dchen. Over time, I grew used to it. Or maybe I simply became numb until I met Xiezhon. Only then did my cold, dead heart begin to beat again. He was possessive and demanding, forcing me to dismiss all 38 of my lovers. He clung to me, insisting I divorce Pei Yu and marry him. He wouldn't take no for an answer. I had no choice but to come back to settle things with Pei Yu. I recalled the threatening look in Xiezhon's eyes before he left today, and I began to feel a sense of urgency. I slammed the divorce papers onto the table in front of Pei Yu. I'm not playing games. This time, I mean it. I slapped the divorce papers onto the table in front of Pei Yu. I'm not playing around. This time, I'm serious. For a long time, Pei Yu squinted at me, as if he finally realized I meant it this time. It's because of that new lover, that immature boy, isn't it? I cleared my throat. Xiezhon had indeed caused quite a stir recently, enough that even Pei Yu had heard about him back then. Xiezhon had stormed into my palace, dragged over a chair, and summoned all 38 of my lovers. He placed a dagger, poison, and a white silk cord on the left, and a stack of silver notes on the right. In a slow, measured tone, he announced, from now on, I don't want to see any of you near the princess again. If you want to live, take the silver and leave. Don't ever set foot in the capital again. Otherwise, he paused, his gaze sweeping over the trembling crowd of men. I'll make sure you all have a place in the mass grave on the eastern hill. My lovers wept like delicate flowers in the rain, begging me to spare them. But Xiezhon wasn't fazed. He calmly sharpened the dagger, one stroke after another, scaring them to the point where they couldn't stop shaking in his presence. I had no choice but to dismiss them all. Yes. I couldn't help but let out a helpless smile. Thinking of Sejong's stubborn and domineering ways, Pei Yu stayed silent for a long time. Then, without warning, he shot to his feet. Liu Pianyu, startled, stumbled and fell to the ground. The teacup on the table tipped over and shattered with a sharp, crisp sound. Such majesty from Her Highness, the princess. Pei Yu spat, his voice cold as ice. You said we'd stay out of each other's affairs. But now that you've found a new lover, you want a divorce. He glared at me, his tone laced with frost. Forgive me, but I have no time to entertain your whims any longer. With that, he turned to leave. I grabbed his sleeve. Don't worry, I'll explain everything to the emperor. You won't be dragged into this. And as for Liu Pianyu, haven't you always wanted to marry her? A divorce will benefit us both. Why are you so angry? A divorce will benefit us both. Pei Yu stopped in his tracks, slowly turning back, his expression strangely curious. Yes, you can marry Liu Pianyu, and I'll marry Sejong. We'll both get what we want. Isn't that good? This was probably the first time I'd ever brought up the idea of divorce so calmly. I thought Pei Yu would immediately agree. After all, I was well aware of how much he loathed me after all these years, but instead, he suddenly turned back, slamming me against the wall. He leaned close to my ear, his voice full of suppressed fury as he gritted out, Chen Zhao, you really want to divorce me? I nodded. He snatched the divorce papers from my hands and, right before my eyes, tore them into shreds. Keep dreaming, Pei. You must be losing his mind. He left so hastily that he even forgot to take Liu Pianyu with him. It was I who had someone send her away. Lying in bed, I couldn't make sense of it, except to assume that Pei Yu, as a man, felt his pride wounded by the fact that I had cuckolded him. Perhaps that's why he was refusing to divorce me, his twisted form of revenge. But with all my previous lovers, he had never been this furious. I couldn't help but press my hand to my forehead as I recalled the rage in his eyes when he stormed out. Pei Yu was the type to never back down once he set his mind to something. It seemed this divorce would be a long, drawn-out affair that night. For the first time in a long while, I dreamt of Pei Yu since the day he redeemed Liu Pianyu, severing all ties with me. I hadn't dreamed of him, but in this dream, I was back 3 years ago. He had just passed the imperial examination, parading through the city on horseback, becoming the object of every young maiden's affection in the capital. But I had seen so many top scholars come and go that I barely paid attention to him back then. It wasn't until a small banquet hosted by my younger royal sister that I began to take notice of Pei Yu, the 10th princess, and I weren't born of the same mother, and she had always resented the special favor the emperor and empress showed me. During the flower viewing event, she deliberately asked everyone present to compose a poem, but I had never been fond of books and lacked any talent for poetry. It would have been embarrassing to openly admit that in front of so many distinguished guests of the capital. Then, I caught sight of Pei Yu standing nearby and gave him a pleading look. Silently asking for his help, Pei Yu glanced at me once before coolly looking away. I thought he refused to assist me. And just as I was starting to panic, a crumpled piece of paper landed on my table. I unfolded it and found a poem written in bold, sweeping strokes, nothing like the reserved man Pei Yu appeared to be. The poem was something I could never have composed, not in a lifetime. Overjoyed, I looked back at him. Pei Yu didn't look at me, bathed in the moonlight. He stood among the crowd, yet seemed completely out of place, as if he didn't belong to this world at that moment. I heard my own heartbeat pounding in my chest when I returned to the palace. I immediately begged the emperor to grant me a marriage with him. At first, my father was reluctant. Though Pei Yu had earned the top scholar title, his family was nothing more than simple farmers and scholars, with no officials in their ranks. But after much pestering, my father sent someone to inquire with the Pei family. He hadn't issued an imperial edict outright, for fear that Pei Yu might refuse the marriage and would become a resentful pair. But the Pei family, from top to bottom, agreed joyfully, and I took that as a sign that Pei Yu was willing as well. It wasn't until much later that I learned Pei Yu's heart belonged to a courtesan who had helped him during his difficult days. He had been waiting to pass the exams so he could marry her, but his family, seeing the glory that came with marrying a princess, deemed a courtesan unworthy of Pei Yu and had forced an end to their relationship. The emperor hadn't issued a decree immediately, fearing that if Pei Yu wasn't willing to marry a princess, they'd become a pair of resentful strangers. But when the Pei family eagerly agreed, I assumed Pei Yu was willing too. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. Pei Yu's heart had always belonged to a courtesan who had helped him during his most difficult days. He had been waiting to pass the exams so he could marry her. But to the Pei family, marrying a princess was the highest honor, and a courtesan could never be worthy of Pei Yu. So, they buried the truth on our wedding day. I was filled with joy. But Pei Yu remained distant, refusing even to share a bed with me. I convinced myself that he was merely adjusting to marriage. I thought that if I treated him well enough, he would eventually grow fond of me. I cooked soup for him with my own hands, but he wouldn't drink it. I waited at the gates every day to greet him after court, just to exchange a few words. But he always claimed he was too busy with work and retreated to his study. Anything I gifted him was politely returned, saying he had no need for it. Over time, his attitude gradually softened, and I thought I had finally warmed his heart. But soon after, Liu Pianyu appeared, crying at my doorstep. She claimed she had been mistreated by a patron and that life was no longer worth living. All she wanted before she died was to see Pei Yu one last time that night. Pei Yu carried her away, and he didn't return the very next day. He redeemed her, bought her a house, and from then on, he visited our home less and less. I screamed, cursed, begged, and even smashed everything in the house. I held shards of broken porcelain to my neck, threatening to kill myself unless he sent Liu Pianyu away. But he merely cast a cold glance at me, turned, and walked out without saying another word. It was then I finally understood. Pei Yu's heart wasn't made of stone. He had simply given it to someone else a long time ago. The next morning, my maid whispered to me, "Your Highness, the young master is waiting outside. He says he wants to see you." I sighed, already dreading the encounter, and made my way to the main hall. Xiaozhan was sitting there, casually sipping tea, dressed in striking red, with raven black hair and those sharp, phoenix-shaped eyes that seemed to gleam with mischief. He looked less like a nobleman and more like one of those seductive fox spirits from old folklore. "So, did you divorce him yet?" he asked. Raising an eyebrow, I stammered, "Not yet." Xiaozhan smirked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Could it be that your highness can't bear to part with him?" That was just like Xiaozhan, jealousy incarnate. Our first meeting had been rather strange. I was strolling through the streets with a few of my lovers when we overheard a commotion. A servant returned to inform me that there had been an incident at Zui Chun Lu, a brothel known for abducting young women from good families and forcing them into prostitution. Several people had already died, and the authorities had just arrived. The madam of the brothel tried to invoke the name of Prince Jin to protect her establishment, and the situation was growing tense. With nothing better to do, I decided to intervene, flashing the insignia of the Princess Zhao Yang. "Search the place. If there's any trouble, tell Prince Jin to come see me." The madam paled and backed down immediately, driven by curiosity. I entered the brothel myself. In a dim storage room, I found a stunning young man. He was covered in bruises, clearly starving and dehydrated. His lips were cracked and bleeding. It's hard not to be moved by beauty, and my heart ached at the sight of him. I helped him up and personally gave him water to drink. When I asked who he was, he refused to speak. I assumed he was an orphan with nowhere to go, so I brought him back to the palace. At first, I thought of taking him in as a lover, and he was sweet and attentive, calling me Zhao Zhao before long. But after a few days, he suddenly disappeared. We met again at a banquet. I had come alone that night, feeling rather bored, when a striking young man in red, with golden hairpins in his dark hair, approached me. He poured me a drink, the corners of his lips curling into a mischievous smile. How should I repay the princess for saving my life? It wasn't until later that I learned he wasn't an orphan at all. He was the young heir of the Duke of Zhenguo's family. He had spent most of his childhood on the frontier with his grandfather, the old duke, and had only recently returned to the capital. But he had gotten separated from his servants and, having no money, was lured into a trap by a trafficker who admired his beauty and sold him to the brothel. Of course, Xiaozhan had tried to fight his way out. With his martial skills, he could have easily escaped, but the drug they gave him weakened him, and even he couldn't fend off so many people at once. He was beaten and locked up, and just when he thought he might die, I arrived. The poor young heir, it broke my heart when I heard his story. Not only was he beautiful, but he was also reckless and not very bright. Why did he have to be an heir? If he had been a commoner, I would have made him my 39th lover without thinking, I teasingly said. You owe me your life. Naturally. You should repay me by marrying me. I expected Sejong to be angry, but instead, his lips curved into a smile. All right. He said I was genuinely happy with Sejong for a few days. He was handsome, affectionate, and I adored him, but soon enough, I discovered something. This man's jealousy knew no bounds. First, he forbade any of my other lovers from attending to me. Then, he demanded that I dismiss them altogether. Finally, he even insisted I divorce Pei-yu and marry him instead. I gave in a little, only to find myself retreating more and more, seeing the growing danger in his eyes. I sighed in resignation. I promise I'll divorce him. But you need to give me more time. Sejong rose to his feet and tapped the table in front of me with his fingers. 1 month. If he still doesn't agree by then, I'll deal with him myself. Since that day, Pei-yu hadn't returned home, and the matter of the divorce remained unresolved. On the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Sejong came to find me, asking me to watch the lanterns with him. The entire capital was aglow, the streets alive with people, crowded and bustling with excitement. At one stall, Sejong picked up a fox mask and held it up to my face, then replaced it with a mask of a demon. But in the end, he chose to wear the white fox mask himself. With his tall and striking figure, he turned heads wherever he went, drawing the smiles and stares of passing women. Feeling annoyed, I reached up to grab the white fox mask from his face. Give me that one. You wear mine. But he, being taller, simply held it out of my reach, teasing me. We were laughing and playfully bickering when suddenly, Sejong stopped. Following his gaze, I saw Pei-yu standing not far away, dressed in a light green robe, with Liu Pian-yu at his side. His eyes were fixed on me, his face expressionless. The smile slowly faded from my lips. During the 3 years I was married to Pei-yu, I had asked him countless times to come with me to the Lantern Festival. Every time, he refused, saying he was too busy with official duties. But now, I saw the truth. It was never about his duties, it was about spending time with Liu Pian-yu. My enthusiasm for the evening drained away, and I tugged on Sejong's sleeve. Let's go. As we walked away, I caught sight of a beautiful white rabbit lantern at the end of a lantern stall. It was intricately carved from white jade, small and delicate, with ruby red eyes that sparkled under the glow of the candlelight. The tassels were made from fine millet beads, glimmering softly in the flickering light. I stopped in my tracks, feeling a wave of nostalgia wash over me. Suddenly, I remembered the lantern my mother had made for me before she passed away. I was still a child then, begging to go out and see the Lantern Festival. But at the time, my grandmother was still alive, and she was strict and cold, forbidding any of the royal children from leaving the palace. She even banned the palace maids from buying lanterns for me, saying they were frivolous and would lead to ruin. My mother was already very frail back then, but she had still managed to make me a small lantern. It was white, just like the rabbit lantern in front of me, with a small red candle glowing softly inside. I had been so happy, running around the imperial garden with the lantern while my mother sat nearby, smiling as she watched me. Not long after that, she passed away, and that lantern became the last gift she ever gave me. But it was made of paper, and despite my careful attempts to preserve it, the years had taken their toll, and the lantern eventually fell apart. Now, seeing a similar rabbit lantern brought back a flood of emotions. I tugged on Sejong's sleeve and said, "Sejong, I want that lantern. Can you get it for me?" Sejong immediately agreed and approached the stall owner to buy it. However, the owner refused, saying the lantern was the prize for tonight's riddle contest. Whoever solved the most riddles would win the lantern. Sejong looked troubled as he leaned close and whispered in my ear, "Jiao Jiao, I'm not good at riddles." I glanced at him. Sejong, like me, wasn't one for books. He'd spent his childhood at the frontier, learning martial arts. He was unbeatable in a fight. But when it came to riddles, his expression suddenly grew serious. "I'll try my best." Despite his lack of experience, Sejong managed to solve several riddles. But when it came to the last one, he was stumped. The riddle was a pair of jade from Seong River, once stained with the tears of 2 concubines. Neither of us had heard this poem before. We exchanged confused glances, unsure of the answer. Suddenly, a soft voice spoke up beside us. Chopsticks. I turned to see Pei-yu standing there, looking at the lantern as if he hadn't even noticed we were there. I frowned. Of course, Pei-yu, a scholar who had topped the imperial exams, would be skilled in poetry and riddles. if he decided to join the contest. What chance did Xie and I have? I whispered, trying to reason with him. Pei Yu. This lantern looks just like the one my mother made for me before she passed. Can you let me have it? I'll trade you something else in return. There were plenty of treasures in the palace. This lantern wasn't particularly valuable, but its craftsmanship was exquisite. Before Pei Yu could respond, Liu Pianyu tugged at his sleeve, smiling sweetly at me. Your Highness, I quite like this lantern too. Why don't we each try our luck? I was about to lose my temper, but Pei Yu didn't give me the chance. In one breath, he solved all the remaining riddles. The crowd around us gasped in admiration, and the stall owner smiled as he handed the lantern to Pei Yu. Young master, your talent is remarkable. This lantern is yours. I wanted to plead with him further, but Pei Yu didn't even glance at me. He took the lantern and walked away without a word. I was furious, clenching my teeth in frustration, unable to hold back. I muttered under my breath. Furious, I gritted my teeth and muttered, what a pair of scoundrels without the rabbit lantern. My mood plummeted for the rest of the evening. Xie noticed my dejection and pointed toward a tall tower, saying, Jiao Jiao, do you like that lantern up there? I'll get it for you if you want. I looked up and saw an even more beautiful lotus lantern hanging from the top of the tower. It was exquisitely crafted, each petal inlaid with 5 different colored gemstones, sparkling brilliantly. It was the finest lantern at the festival, and also the hardest to obtain. To win it, one had to reach the top of the tower using only their martial skills, defeating all other challengers in midair. I hesitated. It's not worth getting hurt for a lantern, but Xie only smiled. Then, with a gust of wind, he shot past me, running up the wall and launching himself into the air. Others were already eyeing the lantern, and a few challengers leaped toward it as well without drawing his sword. Xie deftly flicked open a folding fan and blocked one man's attack, then sent another flying with a swift kick as he unfolded the landscape-painted fan with a graceful flick. All the others tumbled to the ground one by one. With a quick movement, Xie hooked the lantern onto the tip of his boot. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and the girls nearby watched him with wide, admiring eyes, some even blushing at the sight amidst the applause. Xie descended from the tower and handed the lantern to me under the glow of 1,000 lanterns. His eyes sparkled like stars. Your Highness, he said with a playful smile. Mission accomplished. I happily carried the lantern back to the palace, but when I stepped into my room, I froze. Xie had urgent matters to attend to, so I had returned to the palace alone. But I hadn't expected Pei Yu to be here as well. Wasn't he supposed to be with Liu Pianyu? Surprisingly, Pei Yu's expression was more relaxed than usual, and there was even a faint smile on his lips. He looked at me, the corner of his mouth quirking up. What's the matter? Did that Xie fellow fail to win you a lantern? Of course. He was here to mock me, as if stealing my rabbit lantern for Liu Pianyu wasn't enough. Now he had to rub salt in the wound. I glanced at him briefly, then slowly pulled out the exquisite lotus lantern from my sleeve. Oh, is being good at riddles supposed to impress me? I taunted. This lotus lantern is the finest in the capital, and Xie won it for me. Pei Yu's face darkened instantly. Leave. I want to rest now, I said coldly. I carefully placed the rabbit lantern on a shelf and waved him off. Since the day we were married, Pei Yu and I had never shared a bed. I supposed he was keeping himself pure for Liu Pianyu in the past. I had tried everything, nearly resorting to drugging him, to force him to be with me. But now, just having him in the room filled me with disgust. Yet Pei Yu didn't leave. After a long silence, he said, I'll sleep here tonight. You must be mad. I snapped. Pei Yu was acting strange tonight. Something was off about him. Your precious Liu Pianyu is waiting for you at home, I reminded him, but Pei Yu calmly removed his outer robe, replying coolly, we're husband and wife. What's wrong with sharing a bed? Panic rose in me. But Xie will be back soon. Xie had only gone to drop something off. He'd been staying at the palace these past few days. If he came back and found Pei Yu lying in my bed, knowing Xie's temper, I didn't even want to imagine the outcome. He'd probably tear the entire palace down. Pei Yu's expression darkened, anger flashing in his eyes. Suddenly, he yelled, Xie, all you ever think about is Xie. It was one thing with your other lovers, but how long has it been with him? You even flaunt it in public, clinging to him in front of everyone. What about the royal family's dignity? I was taken aback. Why do you care? You parade around with Liu Pianyu in public all the time. Who are you to judge me, and what does it matter how long I've been with Sejong? I'm going to marry him. 2. Speaking of which, when are you going to sign the divorce papers? Pei-yu stared at me, his dark eyes swirling with barely restrained fury, as if a storm was brewing beneath the surface for a moment. I thought he might explode. I had never seen Pei-yu this angry before, even during our worst arguments. He had always remained cold and distant, watching me throw my tantrums in silence now. Though I was nervous, I straightened my back and warned, Pei-yu, I'm a princess. If you lay a hand on me, I'll have my father execute your entire family. Pei-yu didn't respond. He just kept staring at me. After a long pause, he stood up, still without his outer robe, and stormed out of the room. Slamming the door behind him, a loud crash echoed from outside. What's he gone mad about now? I muttered, following him out. By the time I stepped outside, Pei-yu had already disappeared. One of the maids was crouched on the ground, cleaning up something. When I got closer, I saw that it was the rabbit lantern Pei-yu had won earlier today. The once beautiful and delicate lantern was now shattered into pieces. The ruby eyes nowhere to be seen, Your Highness. The maid said carefully. The prince brought this lantern back for you, but as he was leaving just now, he smashed it. It seemed my relationship with Pei-yu had hit rock bottom. He refused to return to the palace, nor would he sign the divorce papers. It was as if he was determined to drag this out indefinitely. Before I knew it, autumn had arrived, and with it, the royal hunting season. From a distance, I spotted Pei-yu. For once, he wasn't dressed in his usual flowing robes. Instead, he wore a fitted black hunting outfit that made him look even more striking, adding a hint of ruggedness to his elegance. Even now, after everything, I couldn't deny that Pei-yu was incredibly handsome. Suddenly, a hand turned my head away, and a cold voice grumbled, "He's just an old man. Am I not better looking?" I turned to see Sejong, his face full of displeasure as he glared at me. I quickly pushed him away. Careful. What if someone sees us? If they see us, we'll go to the emperor and request a marriage decree. Sejong retorted. By the way, has that Pei fellow still not agreed to the divorce? I hurriedly changed the subject. Look at all the people here today. I heard there are bears in my father's hunting grounds. Have you ever hunted one? Sejong's mood instantly brightened, and he boasted, "A bear? That's nothing. I've killed entire packs of wolves in the northern desert. Just wait, I'll bring back a bear for you, and we'll use its fur as a cushion for your chair." I couldn't help but laugh. A bear pelt for my chair? What am I, a bandit? But before I could stop him, Sejong had already urged his horse forward, galloping off into the forest. Excitement welled up inside me, and I spurred my horse to follow. Even if I couldn't catch a bear, hunting a rabbit would be just as fun. But after riding for a while, I realized I had lost track of the others. The dense forest now surrounded me, and it felt like I was completely alone. Just when things couldn't get worse, a foul, pungent smell filled the air behind me, followed by the thunderous roar of a bear. Terrified, I kicked my horse into a frantic gallop. I rode for what felt like forever until I came to the edge of a deep ravine. My horse couldn't possibly make the jump, and I realized I was trapped. There was no escape. Panicked, I turned around to see the bear charging at me, its massive jaws open wide, teeth glistening red. I thought I was done for, but just as I was about to give up hope, an arrow whistled through the air, striking the bear in the eye. The beast roared in pain but refused to back down. It lunged at me again. My horse reared in fright, and I was thrown violently to the ground. Before I could gather my senses, I felt someone throw themselves over me, and the faint scent of bamboo enveloped me. It was Pei-yu. He had used his body to shield me from the bear's deadly claws. A pained grunt escaped his lips, but with a swift motion, he drew a dagger from his waist and drove it into the bear's other eye, sinking the blade deep into its skull. Moments later, the bear collapsed with a deafening thud. Pei-yu slumped over me, utterly exhausted. I reached out to push him off, but my hand came away sticky with warm blood. He was hurt. We had no idea where we were, and no one responded to our calls for help. Pei-yu's injuries were severe, but luckily, he had brought a medicinal powder with him that helped stop the bleeding, though only just that night. We found a cave to shelter in. He lit a small fire, and we sat around it in silence, neither of us speaking. After some time, I asked quietly, "Why did you save me?" I couldn't help but wonder. Our relationship had long since soured, to the point where we barely tolerated each other. Pei-yu, pale from blood loss, stared at the flickering flames. His expression distant. I don't know. He murmured. I just reacted. A strange, complicated feeling stirred within me ever since I had asked for a divorce because of Sejong. Pei Yu had been acting differently. He wasn't the same as before. The atmosphere grew awkward. The night was chilly, and I instinctively curled up against the cold, noticing. Pei Yu removed his outer robe and draped it over me. You're hurt, I protested, pushing it back. You need this more than I do, but Pei Yu was firm. Keep it on. I'm still a man. I'll be fine. For the first time since our marriage, we sat together like this, peacefully and quietly once. This would have made me ecstatic, but now, all I felt was a confusing mix of emotions. After a while, I grew restless and stood to poke at the firewood. That's when I noticed that Pei Yu's pale face had turned flushed. His eyes hazy as he leaned back against the cave wall with his eyes closed. It was clear he had developed a fever. I quickly covered him with the robe again and fetched water to cool him down. In the soft glow of the firelight, his skin gleamed like warm jade, glowing faintly, but no matter how many times I wiped him down, his fever didn't break. His lips were cracked and dry, and the wound, deep and severe, remained swollen and inflamed despite the blood having stopped. I feared that if we weren't found soon, Pei Yu would die from the fever. Gritting my teeth, I stripped off my clothes and plunged into the icy water of the nearby stream. Once my body was chilled, I hurried back and slipped under his outer robe, pressing myself against him. Holding him close, I shivered violently from the cold, but all I could feel was the burning heat radiating from Pei Yu's body, as if I were hugging a furnace. He let out a low groan and slowly opened his eyes. His long, dark lashes trembled as his fevered gaze softened. His voice was hoarse as he murmured, "You don't have to do this." I closed my eyes and replied, "Don't overthink it. You saved my life, and I can't just stand by and watch you die. Once we get out of here, we'll be even." There was no trace of the cold indifference I had come to expect from Pei Yu. His black hair spilled across the ground, and in the firelight, there was a rare softness to him. He looked down at me quietly and, after a long pause, asked, "What's so great about Sejong?" I thought for a moment before answering. His handsome. Pei Yu snorted softly. "Not as handsome as me." I raised my eyebrows, surprised. Pei Yu had always hated it when people commented on his looks, but now he seemed almost proud. "He has a good job at the Dali court. Young and promising," I continued. Pei Yu scoffed. "I'm a higher rank than him at the Hanlin Academy." I smirked. "He treats me well." Pei Yu fell silent. Momentarily stunned, I snuggled closer to Pei Yu, feeling the heat radiating from his feverish body. Yet, I couldn't help but smile as I thought of Sejong. "He only has eyes for me," I said softly. "He doesn't care about anyone else. He's always honest with me, never deceiving me. He said he'll marry me and be with me forever." Pei Yu, for once, seemed lost for words. After a long pause, he awkwardly turned his head away. "He's just a young fool, swept up in his feelings." "Do you really believe him?" "I do," I said firmly. "I know what it's like to love someone, and I know he loves me." After saying this, I felt a bit embarrassed and quickly added, "What about you and Liu Pianyu? Why do you love her?" Pei Yu frowned slightly, as if unsure of the answer himself. "When I first came to the capital to take the imperial exams, I fell seriously ill. My family didn't have enough money to buy medicine, and I fainted by a stream near a brothel. Liu Pianyu saved me and took care of me. She sold herself every day to pay for my medicine so that I could take the exams. I promised her that if I passed, I would come back, redeem her, and marry her. But when I returned, I learned that my family had already agreed to the marriage with the princess. I owe her." "Do you love her?" I asked, tilting my head. Then I immediately regretted asking. I knew Pei Yu despised women like me, lavish, adorned in gold, uneducated. Compared to me, Liu Pianyu must seem like the ideal woman, cultured, gentle, like a lotus flower blooming in clear water. Why else would he keep her as his mistress? Pei Yu didn't answer for a long time. He furrowed his brow, as if he didn't know the answer himself. The fire crackled softly between us, and finally, he muttered, "I owe her." I nodded. "True, but none of this is my fault. When my father asked your family if you had any commitments, they said you had no engagement or lover and that marrying a princess was an honor for the Pei family. If I had known, I wouldn't have stood in the way of true love." I smiled faintly. "But it's not too late. Once we get back, we'll divorce. And you can marry her. We'll each go our separate ways. Pei Yu's lips tightened. You still want a divorce? What else would we do? I replied. Don't tell me you've suddenly realized you love me and can't bear to let me go. Pei Yu opened his mouth, as if to laugh it off. But no sound came. Instead, he lowered his head, looking almost defeated. Chen Zhao. If. Zhao Zhao. Pei Yu's voice was abruptly cut off by another. Xiaozhan had found us. He quickly dismounted and rushed to me, wrapping his arms around me as his whole body trembled. You're safe, Xiaozhan murmured, his voice shaky. It's my fault. I was too busy hunting the bear. I should have stayed with you. Thank goodness you're all right. If anything had happened to you. He couldn't finish the sentence, pulling me closer in a tight embrace. He was so tall that I could barely breathe after holding me for a moment. Xiaozhan finally realized that I was barely dressed. His eyes darkened, and he turned to glare at Pei Yu. You. I quickly explained everything to him. Xiaozhan pursed his lips. Then without another word, took off his cloak and wrapped it around me. He lifted me into his arms and carried me to his horse. He glanced back at Pei Yu. Thank you for saving Zhao Zhao. Pei Yu's voice was cold. I saved my wife. I don't need gratitude from an outsider. When we returned, my father praised Pei Yu for his bravery in saving me. Initially, my father hadn't been fond of Pei Yu, especially after the scandal with Liu Pianyu. He had been so furious that he'd almost had him executed. It was only after my endless pleading that he spared Pei Yu's life later, as I filled my palace with lover after lover, and Pei Yu's reputation became more tarnished by association. My father simply turned a blind eye to the situation this time. My father patted my hand and said, Zhao Yang. Young couples always have their disagreements. Your mother and I quarreled plenty when we were younger. He risked his life to save you, which shows he still cares. Now that you've sent all those lovers away, it's time to settle down and live peacefully with Pei Yu. Pei Yu's wounds took a long time to heal. The imperial physician said that the injury had been life-threatening, and if the bear's claws had been even half an inch deeper, not even the gods could have saved him during this time. He stayed at the princess's palace to recuperate. Liu Pianyu sent people several times to visit him, but for some reason, Pei Yu refused to see her more. Strangely, he started visiting me more often. One evening, he came into my room, the faint scent of alcohol clinging to him. It seemed he had been drinking. I frowned. You've just recovered. You shouldn't be drinking. To my surprise, Pei Yu's expression softened, and he nodded quietly, as if agreeing with me. I was immediately suspicious. What was he up to? He sat down at the table, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across his face. He had grown thinner during his recovery, but even in this frail state, he looked as striking as ever, like a figure from a painting. After a long silence, just as I was about to yawn from exhaustion, Pei Yu suddenly spoke. Chen Zhao, what if I send Liu Pianyu away and we don't divorce? How would that be? I thought I had misheard him and blinked in confusion. What? Pei Yu looked up at me, his gaze steady, as if he had finally made a difficult decision. I've been thinking about it lately, he said quietly. I was too obsessed with repaying the debt I owe to Pianyu. His eyelashes fluttered slightly, and his voice dropped. You asked me if I loved her, and I couldn't answer. I owe her. I promised to take care of her for the rest of my life. But I think I don't love her. I think the one I... Pei Yu trailed off, turning his head away in a rare moment of vulnerability. I'll give her a sum of money and send her away. After that, let's live a good life together. What do you say? His voice softened as he leaned closer to me. Zhao Zhao, I know you still care for me. Those men you brought in, they were just to make me jealous. Right? Jealous? Are you kidding? I scoffed before I could continue. Xiaozhan suddenly leaped in through the window and pulled me to his side, glaring at Pei Yu. What are you doing here? Pei Yu, Xiaozhan demanded. Pei Yu paused, his smile fading. I'm in my wife's room. What's wrong with that? The real question is, what's a duke's son doing sneaking into a married woman's chambers in the middle of the night? Is this the kind of behavior the Duke of Zhanguo's family encourages? His words were sharp, but Xiaozhan just smiled coldly. Better than the kind of upbringing that encourages a man to keep a mistress while being married. Pei Yu, I thank you for saving Zhao Zhao, but she's going to marry me. If you're smart, you'll sign the divorce papers soon. Pei Yu, unable to hold back any longer, stepped forward and grabbed my other hand. What right do you have to say that? Xiaozhan answered calmly. I'm the man Zhao Zhao loves. Pei Yu's lips curled into a mocking smile. You've only known her for a short time. How long has she even liked you? We've been married for 3 years. Zhao Zhao has loved me for 3 years. What makes you think you're any different from the lovers she's discarded? Just like the others. You'll be tossed aside when she gets bored. Xiaozhan's eyes darkened. And without warning, he punched Pei Yu in the face. Pei Yu, still weak from his injury, staggered back a few steps, wiping the blood from his mouth with a bitter smile. How long do you think she'll care for you? Xiaozhan, how long will you love her? You're not her beloved. At best, you're just a distraction, a toy she's using to pass the time while I'm not around. Xiaozhan's face was as dark as thunder, his rage simmering just below the surface. Enough, I shouted. Pushing Pei Yu away, I stared at him coldly. Xiaozhan is not a toy. He's not like the other lovers I've had. He is the one I love. Pei Yu froze, as if the words had struck him like a blow. After a long moment, his lips twitched, as if trying to force a smile. But he failed. His expression faltered. And without another word, he pushed past me and stormed out of the room. It had been 3 months since Liu Pian had last come to see me. I didn't expect her to return, especially in such a pitiful state. She cried like a delicate flower in the rain, her eyes swollen, and she knelt on the ground, kowtowing to me. Your Highness, I only want to stay by Pei Lang's side, even as a servant. Please, show mercy and don't drive me away. Her words were pleading, but the resentment in her eyes was unmistakable. When did I ever tell you to leave? I asked. Puzzled. Liu Pian lifted her tear-streaked face. Pei Lang suddenly said he would give me money and told me to leave. He's always treated me well. He would never do that unless you ordered him to. The crowd of onlookers was growing, and I didn't want to make a scene. I looked down at her coldly. Liu Pian, I am the Grand Princess of Chen. If I truly wanted you gone, I would have 1,000 ways to make you disappear without a trace. It was Pei Yu who sent you away. It had nothing to do with me. Her face went deathly pale, and she whispered in disbelief. No, that's not possible. He promised me he would stay with me forever, he said. I lost interest in the conversation and ordered her to be taken away. Later that day, Pei Yu asked me to wait for him at the palace, saying he had something important to discuss. But by the time evening fell, he still hadn't returned. One of the servants looked uneasy as he approached me. Miss Liu was attacked by bandits on the road outside the city. The prince went to rescue her. I responded with a simple "Oh," not particularly bothered, and left to spend the evening with Xiaozhan. It wasn't until late that I returned to the palace, where I found Pei Yu drunk, sitting in the room with a vacant expression. He looked up, his eyes tinged red, his voice devoid of emotion. Where were you out? I said casually. Did you manage to save Liu Pian? Pei Yu stared at me. She said you were the one who sent the bandits after her. I was startled. What? Why would I do that? Pei Yu fell silent for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. I almost wish it was you, because now you don't have any feelings for me at all. You probably wish Liu Pian and I would run away together and never show up in front of you again. He wasn't wrong. I'm going to bed. I hinted that he should leave, but Pei Yu lowered his head and quietly said, Zhao Zhao, today is my birthday. I froze, realizing that today was indeed Pei Yu's birthday. In the past, I would have prepared months in advance, racking my brain to find something he would like, but now I had completely forgotten. Pei Yu looked at me for a long time. You were just with him, weren't you? I didn't reply, which was enough of an answer. Pei Yu's lips curled into a bitter smile. Chen Zhao, you're truly something. Anger flared up in me. You have no right to criticize me. Weren't you the one who redeemed Liu Pian and made her your mistress? And today, weren't you with her? Who knows? Maybe you were whispering sweet nothings to each other. What gives you the right to judge me? Pei Yu suddenly stood and grabbed my wrist, his voice thick with barely restrained fury. I was with her. Yes. She cried and begged me to stay, but I told her I wanted to live a good life with you. I sent her away. I scoffed. And what good does that do now? Pei Yu, it's been 3 years. His grip on my wrist trembled, and slowly, he let go. After a long pause, his voice cracked as he asked, Zhao Zhao, is it really too late? I turned my head away. It's too late. Pei Yu, I waited for you for 3 years, but no one waits forever. From that day on, Pei Yu followed me everywhere. No matter where I went with Xiaozhan, Pei Yu was always there, ruining our time together. Xiaozhan was so angry that he muttered about finding someone to ambush him one day. While we were out shopping for rouge, Pei Yu appeared again. He picked up a pinkish rouge powder and said, "Zhao Zhao's porcelain skin would look better with this color." Xiaozhan rolled his eyes, about to respond when a sudden scream pierced the crowd. I turned just in time to see Liu Pianyu rushing at us, a dagger in her hand, her eyes blazing with fury. "Die!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with rage. Pei Yu quickly pushed me behind him, but in that instant, I instinctively moved to shield Xiaozhan, and he pulled me down, covering me with his body. Pei Yu looked stunned, and then the dagger struck, piercing Pei Yu's chest. On the third day of Pei Yu's unconsciousness, I called for Liu Pianyu to be interrogated in the dark, damp prison. She was covered in blood, her body a mess of bruises and wounds. There wasn't a patch of skin left unscathed. Her hair was matted with dried blood, and when she lifted her head to look at me, her eyes were filled with venom. The pitiful, weak girl she once pretended to be had vanished. Her voice, now hoarse and ragged, rasped, "Why?" An official hurriedly brought over a chair for me to sit on and scolded her loudly. "How dare you speak so rudely to the princess? You're nothing but a lowly prostitute, princess." Liu Pianyu's voice was mocking. Then she laughed, a cold and bitter sound. "So what if you're a princess? Pei Lang still doesn't love you. Let me tell you something. He spent every night with me these past 2 years. He said he despised you, said you were vulgar and uneducated, and that all you knew how to do was flatter him. He promised me he would marry me, that he would always love me." I raised an eyebrow. "If he loved you so much, why did he send you away?" Liu Pianyu froze, then lifted her head to glare at me with venomous hatred. "Your Highness, you already have everything, a noble birth, beauty, parents who dote on you. You have all the good things in life. Why did you have to take Pei Lang from me too? I have nothing. All I had was Pei Lang to save him. I sold myself day after day, and in the process, I ruined my health. I'll never be able to have children. All I had left was Pei Lang's love. But you couldn't even leave that for me. You couldn't leave me a single path to survival. Do you know how much I hate you? I wanted to kill you. Why should you have everything just because you were born a princess, while I have nothing? You even took the only man I had left. You're a princess. Let's see if a princess bleeds and dies the same way we commoners do." She was practically insane. I watched her, unfazed. "Liu Pianyu, do you think Pei Yu is a fool? Maybe at first he believed your lies, but by now, even someone as blind as him must have seen through you." I continued, unbothered. "You once claimed you sold yourself every day to support him, but we both know you were one of the most popular women in the brothel. Every time you had a client, you made at least several taels of silver. And who knows how much you saved up. It didn't take much to pay for Pei Yu's treatment or help him pass the imperial exams. I did some investigating. You've supported 28 scholars over the years. 2 of them passed their exams but then turned their backs on you. And the rest were just useless. You're getting older, and business isn't what it used to be. Pei Yu was your last chance, so you clung to him, weaving your sob story, not letting go. Am I right?" Liu Pianyu's face turned ashen, and she bit down hard on her lip, panic flickering in her eyes. "You're lying." I smiled. "You think Pei Yu hasn't figured it out by now? Maybe at first he was fooled, but after all this time, even someone as naive as him would see through your act. You're lucky he's offering you money to leave. You should be grateful." I didn't bother saying more. I had only come to understand why Liu Pianyu had tried so hard to kill me. The interrogation revealed that she had aimed to kill me, but Pei Yu stepped in, and she accidentally stabbed him instead just as I was about to leave. Liu Pianyu's trembling voice stopped me. How is Pei Lang?" I didn't answer and walked out. Pei Yu finally woke up 4 days later. He had been unconscious for 7 days. He had already been injured before, and now, with this wound on top of the others, his face was as pale as death, and even his lips had lost their color. I felt a complicated mix of emotions. After all, he had saved me that day. If not for him, I might have been the one lying in that bed, gravely wounded. Pei Yu didn't say anything, and I didn't know what to say either. The room was filled with an awkward silence. After a long pause, his hoarse voice broke through. "Chen Zhao, bring out the divorce papers. I'll sign." And so, Pei Yu and I were finally divorced. He resigned from his position and said he wanted to travel the world. His family didn't understand, crying and pleading with him not to go. But Pei Yu didn't look back the day he left the capital. I stood on the city wall and watched him go. It felt as though fate had always kept us just out of reach from each other, destined to never truly be together. He was on a black horse. And from a distance, he turned to look back. I didn't know if he saw me or not. He just gazed for a moment before turning away and riding off, never looking back again. A year later, I married Siejeon. It had taken so long because my father, worried after everything, put Siejeon through a year of thorough investigation. He needed to make sure Siejeon had no savior from the past or any unattainable love. Only after confirming that Siejeon had no improper relationships with any women during that year did my father feel secure enough to grant us his blessing on the day of our wedding. The streets of the capital were filled with red decorations. The wedding procession stretched so far that even after the first people had reached the front of the street, the others at the back were still far behind. It was a grand celebration. As I stepped out of the bridal sedan, Siejeon should have been holding the traditional red silk ribbon to lead me into the house. That's how Pei Yu had done it when we married, but instead, Siejeon dismounted his horse, reached out, and clasped my hand, intertwining his long fingers with mine. Everyone around us smiled warmly. I whispered, "What are you doing?" He grinned. I couldn't wait. A gust of wind blew, and the veil over my head lifted slightly, just enough for me to glimpse something in the corner of my eye. In the shadows, there stood a figure dressed in black, watching me intently. I froze for a moment. The past remained. He looked just as he always had once. It was his hand that led me, but when I looked again, there was no one there.